Gideon's story is one of courage, faith, and divine intervention. In the face of overwhelming odds, Gideon answered God's call and led a small army of just 300 men to victory against the mighty Midianite army. This powerful biblical account reminds us that with faith and obedience, even the impossible becomes possible. Join us as we delve into the story of Gideon and uncover the timeless lessons it holds. The story of Gideon begins in a time of turmoil and despair for the Israelites. For 7 long years, the Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, had ravaged the land of Israel. The people of Israel lived in constant fear, retreating to the mountains and hiding in caves to escape the invaders. The Midianites were a nomadic people who swarmed into Israel like locusts, destroying crops, stealing livestock, and leaving the land desolate. The Israelites were reduced to poverty and desperation, crying out to God for deliverance. It was during this dark period that we are introduced to Gideon, a man who appeared to be the least likely candidate for leadership. He was from the tribe of Manasseh, a tribe not known for its prominence or strength, and he described his family as the weakest in the tribe. Gideon himself saw no greatness in his future. He was an ordinary man, working in obscurity to survive. When we first meet him, he is threshing wheat in a winepress, an unusual place for such an activity. Normally, wheat would be threshed on an open threshing floor where the wind could blow away the chaff. But Gideon was threshing in secret, hiding from the Midianites, hoping to keep what little he had from being taken. It is in this unlikely setting that the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon. This divine messenger greets him with a remarkable statement: "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." These words must have sounded almost absurd to Gideon. How could he, a man in hiding, be called a mighty warrior? Gideon's response reveals his doubts, both about himself and about God. He questions the angel, asking, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about?" Gideon's faith had been shaken by years of suffering and oppression, and he struggled to see how God could still be at work. Despite Gideon's doubts, the angel does not rebuke him. Instead, the angel delivers God's call: "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon, overwhelmed by the enormity of the task, immediately points out his inadequacies. He reminds the angel of his lowly status, saying, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's humility and self-doubt are evident, but God's response is clear and reassuring. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Even with this promise, Gideon is hesitant. He asks for a sign to confirm that this call truly comes from God. In an act of faith mingled with uncertainty, Gideon prepares an offering of meat, bread, and broth, and presents it to the angel. The angel instructs him to place the offering on a rock and pour the broth over it. Then, in a dramatic display of divine power, the angel touches the offering with the tip of his staff, and fire consumes it. At this moment, Gideon realizes he has encountered the angel of the Lord. Terrified, he cries out, fearing for his life, but God reassures him with these comforting words: "Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die." This encounter marks a turning point for Gideon. Though he is still uncertain and hesitant, he begins to step into the role God has called him to. That very night, God gives Gideon his first task: to tear down the altar of Baal and the Asherah pole that belonged to his father. These were symbols of idolatry, and their destruction would be a bold declaration of Gideon's allegiance to the one true God. Despite his fear of the townspeople, Gideon obeys. Under the cover of darkness, he takes 10 of his servants and carries out God's command. The next morning, when the townspeople discover what has happened, they demand Gideon's death. However, Gideon's father, Joash, defends him, challenging the people to let Baal defend himself if he truly is a god. This act of obedience, though small compared to the battles ahead, is a significant step for Gideon. It demonstrates his willingness to trust God and take action, even in the face of fear. God is beginning to shape Gideon into the leader. He needs him to be a leader who will rely on divine strength rather than human ability. After receiving his divine calling and tearing down his father's altar to Baal, Gideon still struggled with doubt and uncertainty. While he had taken a courageous first step in obeying God, the task before him seemed monumental. The Midianite army was vast, described in the Bible as being as numerous as locusts, with their camels being countless as the sand on the seashore. Gideon, a humble man from a small, insignificant tribe, felt the weight of the mission God had given him. He needed further reassurance that God would indeed be with him and fulfill his promise of deliverance. It is at this point in the story that Gideon does something both remarkable and relatable. He asks God for confirmation. This act is often referred to as laying out the fleece, and it has become one of the most well-known moments in Gideon's life. Gideon's request was simple but bold. He wanted a sign that would leave no doubt in his mind that God was truly with him and that he was the chosen instrument for Israel's deliverance. Gideon approached God with humility and reverence, saying, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." This request was specific and measurable, designed to confirm God's presence and his promise. Gideon's words reveal a blend of faith and doubt. On one hand, he believed that God was capable of performing such a sign. On the other hand, he needed reassurance to bolster his courage. That night, God answered Gideon's request. When he woke the next morning and went to check the fleece, he found it soaking wet with dew, while the ground around it was completely dry. Gideon wrung out the fleece, collecting a bowlful of water. This miraculous sign should have been enough to confirm God's call, but Gideon, still grappling with his fears, asked for a second sign. Hesitantly, Gideon approached God again, saying, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." It was an audacious request, yet Gideon's words also conveyed his awareness of God's patience and mercy. He knew he was asking a lot, but he desperately needed to be sure. God, in his infinite understanding and kindness, did not rebuke Gideon for his doubt. Instead, he granted the second sign. The next morning, the fleece was dry, while the ground was wet with dew. These signs served a critical purpose for Gideon. They not only confirmed God's presence and promise, but also revealed God's willingness to meet Gideon in his weakness. Rather than demanding blind faith, God patiently worked with Gideon's hesitations, providing tangible evidence of his power and commitment. This interaction highlights an important truth. God does not reject us because of our doubts or fears. Instead, he meets us where we are, providing what we need to move forward in faith. Gideon's requests for signs also demonstrate the importance of seeking God's guidance and assurance in moments of uncertainty. While Gideon's situation was unique, the principle of turning to God for confirmation and clarity remains relevant for believers today. Gideon's story shows that it is not wrong to ask God for guidance when we are faced with daunting challenges or when the path ahead seems unclear. God honors a sincere heart that seeks Him, even when that heart is burdened by doubts. These moments with the fleece marked a turning point for Gideon. With the signs God provided, he could no longer doubt that he was called and equipped by God to lead Israel. The miraculous nature of the fleece tests reassured Gideon that the mission was not dependent on his own strength or ability, but on God's power and faithfulness. Bolstered by this divine confirmation, Gideon was now ready to move forward, gathering an army to face the Midianites. The story of Gideon and the fleece offers a powerful lesson about the character of God. He is a God who understands our frailty and meets us in our moments of uncertainty. He does not abandon us when we hesitate or falter. Instead, He provides what we need to strengthen our faith and prepare us for the tasks ahead. For Gideon, the fleece was a symbol of God's patience, power, and promise, a reminder that he was not alone in the battle to come. With newfound confidence after God's confirmation through the fleece tests, Gideon began to gather an army to face the Midianites. Word spread throughout Israel, and men from several tribes responded to Gideon's call. In a short time, he amassed an impressive force of 32,000 soldiers. Though still vastly outnumbered by the Midianite army, this gathering must have provided some measure of reassurance to Gideon. It seemed like a reasonable starting point for a military campaign. However, God had a surprising plan. He looked at Gideon's army and declared, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, 'My own strength has saved me.'" This declaration must have been shocking to Gideon, with the Midianites' forces being so overwhelmingly vast. Reducing the size of the Israelite army seemed counterintuitive. Yet God's purpose was clear. He wanted the Israelites to know beyond any doubt that their victory would come from Him, not from their own strength or numbers. God instructed Gideon to make an announcement to the troops. "Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." Fear is contagious in an army, and God wanted only those who were willing to trust Him completely to remain. When Gideon relayed this message, 22,000 men left, leaving only 10,000. This massive reduction must have tested Gideon's faith, but he trusted that God's plan would prevail. Even with the remaining 10,000, God was not finished. He told Gideon, "There are still too many men." God then gave specific instructions for a test to further reduce the army. Gideon was to take the men to a water source and observe how they drank. Some of the men knelt down and drank directly from the water, while others cupped water in their hands and lapped it like a dog. God told Gideon to separate the men based on their drinking method, and only those who lapped the water with their hands were to remain. In the end, Gideon was left with just 300 men. The drastic reduction of the army must have seemed almost absurd. From 32,000 to 300, the odds now seemed completely impossible from a human perspective. Yet, this was precisely the point. God was orchestrating the situation so that the victory would be unmistakably His. The 300 men were not chosen for their skill or strength, but because God wanted to show His power through their obedience and faith. These 300 men became known as Gideon's army, a small but determined group ready to follow God's lead. The selection process may also have symbolized the kind of people God was seeking, those who were vigilant, disciplined, and focused. Those who cupped the water in their hands and stayed alert demonstrated an awareness of their surroundings and a readiness for battle. Qualities that would be essential for the unconventional tactics God had in mind. With his tiny army, Gideon faced a daunting challenge. The Midianites and their allies had filled the valley below, their numbers so vast that they appeared like a swarm of locusts. Yet, God reassured Gideon again, saying, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." Gideon obeyed, sending the rest of the men away and keeping only the 300. The remaining soldiers were equipped with provisions and trumpets, and they prepared to follow God's plan. Gideon's faith had grown stronger through the process of reduction. Each step, though seemingly illogical and risky, had deepened his dependence on God. By stripping away human resources, God ensured that Gideon's trust rested fully on divine power, not on numbers or conventional military strategies. This reduction of the army also served as a profound spiritual lesson. It demonstrated that God's ways are not our ways, and that He often works through what appears weak or insignificant to accomplish His purposes. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly chooses the least likely people and circumstances to display His glory. Gideon's 300 men would become a living testimony to the truth that the battle is the Lord's. As Gideon prepared for the upcoming confrontation, he must have felt the tension between human fear and divine trust. Yet through this process, God was building Gideon's faith, shaping him into the leader He needed him to be. Gideon's obedience and willingness to trust in God's unconventional methods became a powerful example of faith in action. The reduction of the army set the stage for one of the most miraculous victories in Israel's history. With just 300 men, Gideon was about to face an army that no human force could defeat. But God had already shown Gideon that he was in control and that nothing was impossible for him. This small band of soldiers, empowered by God's presence, would soon demonstrate the truth that not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. With his army of only 300 men, Gideon stood at the edge of an impossible battle. The Midianite army, described as vast as a swarm of locusts, filled the valley below, their camels alone said to be countless as the sand on the seashore. From a human perspective, the odds were insurmountable. Yet Gideon had learned through the reduction of his forces that the victory would not come through human might, but through God's power and direction. It was not about the size of his army or the strength of his weapons. It was about obedience to the God who had called him. God, knowing Gideon's lingering fears, provided yet another reassurance before the battle. He instructed Gideon to go down to the edge of the Midianite camp during the night and listen. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept close to the camp. There, amidst the tents of the Midianites, he overheard a conversation between two soldiers. One of the soldiers recounted a dream he had. A loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp, striking a tent with such force that it overturned and collapsed. The other soldier interpreted the dream, saying, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." This moment was pivotal for Gideon. Hearing his enemy express fear and acknowledge God's power filled him with renewed courage and confidence. Gideon immediately bowed in worship, thanking God for the assurance of victory. When he returned to his camp, he called his 300 men together and prepared them for battle. Gideon's trust in God was now unwavering. and his leadership inspired his small army to believe in the impossible. The strategy that God gave Gideon was unconventional, to say the least. Instead of equipping his men with swords or shields, Gideon armed them with trumpets, empty jars, and torches. Dividing his army into 3 groups of 100, Gideon positioned them around the perimeter of the Midianite camp. The plan was simple but bold. At Gideon's signal, the men were to blow their trumpets, smash their jars, and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a much larger force surrounding the camp. Under the cover of darkness, the men took their positions. The Midianite camp, likely relaxed and unprepared for an attack, lay in the valley below, unaware of the approaching storm. When the moment came, Gideon gave the signal. Simultaneously, the men blew their trumpets, smashed their jars, and shouted at the top of their lungs, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The sudden noise and chaos startled the Midianites, throwing the entire camp into a state of confusion and panic. The sound of the trumpets echoed through the valley, and the sight of the torches, which appeared to signify a massive army, caused the Midianites to believe they were surrounded by a far greater force. In their terror, the Midianites turned on each other, striking down their own comrades in the darkness. Those who survived fled the camp in disarray, abandoning their supplies and scattering into the wilderness. Gideon and his men pursued the fleeing Midianites, rallying reinforcements from other Israelite tribes to join the chase. The battle, though unconventional, was a resounding victory. With no swords drawn and no conventional combat, the Midianites had been defeated, and the Israelites were delivered from their oppression. The small band of 300, empowered by God's presence and guided by his plan, had achieved what no ordinary army could. This victory was not just a military triumph, it was a spiritual declaration. It demonstrated that God's power is made perfect in weakness, and that his plans often defy human logic. The tools of victory, trumpets, jars, and torches, were symbols of faith and obedience rather than instruments of war. The success of Gideon's army was a testament to what God can accomplish through those who trust him completely. The unconventional battle plan also served as a powerful reminder to the Israelites of their dependence on God. After years of idolatry and rebellion, they were reminded that their strength and security came not from themselves, but from their covenant relationship with God. The destruction of the Midianites was a turning point, not just militarily, but spiritually, as it reaffirmed God's sovereignty and faithfulness to his people. For Gideon, this victory marked a significant moment in his journey of faith. He had gone from a fearful, doubtful man hiding in a winepress to a bold leader who trusted God with everything. The success of the mission was a direct result of his obedience and willingness to follow God's plan, no matter how unconventional it seemed. Gideon's story became a lasting example of what can happen when faith overcomes fear and when reliance on God takes precedence over human reasoning. In the aftermath of the battle, the Israelites celebrated their deliverance, recognizing that the victory was the Lord's. The story of Gideon and his 300 men became a cherished part of Israel's history, a reminder of God's power and faithfulness. It was a story that would be told for generations, inspiring others to trust in the God who can do the impossible. The miraculous victory over the Midianites marked a transformative moment for Gideon and the nation of Israel. What had once seemed impossible, a small force of 300 men triumphing over a massive and well-equipped enemy army, was now a reality. The Israelites were freed from 7 years of oppression, and peace was restored to the land. Yet, as the story of Gideon unfolds, it reveals not only the triumph of faith, but also the complexities of leadership and the challenges that come after success. After the battle, Gideon and his men continued their pursuit of the fleeing Midianites. Although they were weary from their efforts, they remained determined to complete the mission. Gideon's persistence demonstrated his commitment to total victory. He refused to stop until the Midianite kings Zebah and Zalmunna were captured and the enemy completely subdued. Along the way, he encountered resistance from the people of Succoth and Penuel, two Israelite towns that refused to support him and his men. This reluctance to help reflected a lack of faith and unity among the tribes of Israel, but Gideon pressed on without their aid. Eventually, Gideon captured the two kings and brought them to justice. He reminded the Israelites of the importance of trusting in God and relying on his power. This final act of victory solidified Gideon's reputation as a leader and deliverer of Israel. The people, filled with gratitude and admiration, approached Gideon with a remarkable offer. "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." This offer revealed the Israelites' desire for a monarchy, a central figure who could provide leadership and stability. However, Gideon declined, saying, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Gideon's response was a profound statement of humility and faith. He recognized that the victory belonged to God and that Israel's true king was the Lord. By refusing the position of ruler, Gideon sought to redirect the people's focus back to their covenant relationship with God. Despite his noble intentions, Gideon made a decision that would have long-lasting consequences. He requested that each of the Israelites give him a gold earring from the plunder they had taken from the Midianites. The people readily complied, and the gold was collected and melted down. From this gold, Gideon fashioned an ephod, a ceremonial garment or object associated with worship. While Gideon likely intended the ephod to serve as a memorial of God's deliverance, it quickly became a snare for the Israelites. The ephod was placed in Gideon's hometown of Ophrah, and the people began to worship it. What was meant to be a symbol of God's victory turned into an object of idolatry. The Israelites, who had been delivered from oppression by God's power, once again turned away from him and fell into the trap of false worship. This tragic outcome highlights the persistent struggle of the Israelites to remain faithful to God and avoid the allure of idols. For Gideon, this period marked a mixture of success and failure. While he remained faithful to God in many ways, the unintended consequences of his actions revealed the complexities of leadership. His story serves as a reminder that even the best intentions can lead to harmful outcomes when not fully aligned with God's will. The ephod became a symbol of misplaced devotion, distracting the people from their true source of hope and deliverance. In the latter part of his life, Gideon enjoyed a period of peace and stability. The Bible records that the land had peace for 40 years during his leadership. This era of tranquility was a testament to God's faithfulness and Gideon's role in delivering Israel from its oppressors. Gideon's large family, he had 70 sons from many wives, reflected his prominence and influence during this time. However, the peace did not last beyond Gideon's lifetime. After his death, the Israelites quickly reverted to their old ways, turning back to idolatry and abandoning the God who had saved them. They worshipped Baal-berith, a false god, and failed to show gratitude to Gideon's family for the role he had played in their deliverance. This cyclical pattern of faithfulness, deliverance, and rebellion is a recurring theme in the book of Judges and serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of human devotion to God. Gideon's story concludes with a mixture of triumph and tragedy. On one hand, his obedience and faith were instrumental in bringing about one of the most remarkable victories in Israel's history. His willingness to trust God in the face of impossible odds inspired generations and demonstrated the power of faith. On the other hand, his legacy was marred by the unintended consequences of the ephod and the failure of the Israelites to remain faithful after his death. The life of Gideon teaches profound lessons about the nature of faith, leadership, and human weakness. It shows that God can use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things, but it also highlights the importance of remaining vigilant and faithful in all aspects of life. Gideon's rise from a fearful farmer to a mighty warrior reminds us that God's strength is made perfect in weakness, and that he often chooses the least likely candidates to fulfill his purposes. Ultimately, Gideon's story is a testament to God's grace and patience with his people. Even in their failures and shortcomings, God remained faithful, raising up deliverers like Gideon to lead them back to him. The story of Gideon challenges us to trust God in the face of overwhelming odds, to remain faithful in times of success, and to remember that true victory comes not from human strength, but from reliance on the Lord.